The night Daniel walked back into our lives, I didn't expect anything out of the ordinary. My husband, Mark, had always spoken fondly of him, a childhood friend who had moved away years ago but recently returned. To me, Daniel was just another piece of Mark's past, a friendly presence at our dinner table. But I was wrong. That night would shift something in me, something I wasn't ready to admit. Mark and I had been married for 7 years. It wasn't a bad marriage, not in the ways that made for scandalous gossip. There were no screaming matches, no betrayals, no dramatic exits. But there was silence. A creeping, heavy silence that had settled between us like dust on untouched furniture. We coexisted. We talked about schedules, bills, and whether we needed to replace the leaking faucet. But the laughter, the stolen glances, the warmth, they had faded, slowly and imperceptibly, like the last embers of a fire left to die. Daniel's presence disrupted that silence. He arrived at our house for dinner, carrying an easy smile and a bottle of red wine. He had a presence about him, confident, but not imposing. His dark eyes held a quiet intensity, the kind that made you feel seen in a way you hadn't in years. When he spoke, he had a way of making you feel like you were the only person in the room. Throughout the evening, he asked questions. Real questions. Not the polite, surface-level kind, but the kind that made you think before answering. "Do you still write?" he asked me at one point, tilting his head with genuine curiosity. I blinked, caught off guard. It had been years since anyone had asked me that. Since anyone had cared. I used to love writing, short stories, poetry, anything that let me escape into another world. But life had buried that part of me beneath responsibilities and routine. Mark chuckled, not looking up from his plate. "Oh, she used to be obsessed. Not so much anymore, right, Em?" I forced a smile. "Yeah, not so much anymore." Daniel didn't look convinced. He held my gaze for a second too long before finally nodding. The moment passed, but something about it lingered. Later, Mark stepped out to take a work call, leaving Daniel and me alone. The air between us shifted. He leaned back in his chair, studying me with quiet contemplation. "You seem different," he said finally. I laughed, though it sounded hollow. "Different how?" He hesitated before answering. "Like someone who's forgotten what makes her happy." The words hit harder than they should have. I opened my mouth to argue, to dismiss it as nonsense, but nothing came out. Because deep down, I knew he was right. Before I could respond, Mark returned. The moment shattered like glass. But something had already cracked beneath the surface, and I had no idea how deep it would go. After that night, Daniel lingered in my thoughts in a way I couldn't explain, or maybe didn't want to. It wasn't just his words that stayed with me, but the way he had looked at me, as if he saw something in me I had long forgotten. I told myself it was nothing. Just nostalgia, a brief flicker of attention in a life that had settled into monotony. But then it kept happening. Daniel started visiting more often, always under the comfortable pretense of catching up with Mark. They would sit in the living room, reminiscing about their reckless teenage years, while I stayed in the kitchen, pretending to be too busy to join. But somehow, Daniel always found a way to bridge the space between us. One evening, as I stood at the sink washing dishes after dinner, he appeared beside me, rolling up his sleeves. "Here, let me help," he offered, his voice easy and warm. I shook my head. "You're a guest." He smiled, taking a plate from my hands anyway. "I don't mind." Our shoulders brushed as we worked side by side, the silence between us thick with something unspoken. I could feel his presence acutely, every small movement, every breath. It was nothing, and yet it was everything. Then came the moments that couldn't be dismissed as coincidence. At a weekend barbecue in our backyard, Mark was busy chatting with a neighbor while Daniel and I found ourselves alone near the patio. A breeze swept through, carrying the scent of grilled food and summer air. Daniel turned to me, his eyes searching mine. "You ever think about leaving?" he asked suddenly. I blinked, startled. "Leaving what?" He tilted his head slightly, studying me. "This. The routine. The life you didn't choose but somehow ended up in." His words sent a shiver through me, though the evening was warm. I let out a nervous laugh, trying to brush it off. That's a dangerous question. Maybe, he admitted. But that doesn't mean it's the wrong one. Before I could respond, Mark called out to us, shattering the moment. But the damage had been done. A door had been cracked open, and no matter how much I tried to ignore it, I knew, Daniel knew, that something was waiting on the other side. Later that night, I lay in bed beside my husband, staring at the ceiling while his even breathing filled the silence. My thoughts were tangled, my emotions restless. I wasn't in love with Daniel. At least, that's what I told myself. But for the first time in years, I felt something I couldn't name, something that made my heart race and my breath catch. Something dangerous. And I didn't know if I wanted to stop it. The night it all changed, Mark was out of town for a business trip. It was supposed to be just another evening, quiet, predictable. But when Daniel texted me, asking if I wanted to meet up for a drink, I didn't hesitate. I told myself it was harmless. Just two friends catching up. But deep down, I knew better. We met at a quiet bar on the outskirts of town, the kind where the music was low and the lighting was dim. It felt like neutral ground, a place where reality could be bent, where consequences felt distant. Daniel was already waiting when I arrived, a glass of whiskey in front of him. His eyes lit up when he saw me, and for a moment, I forgot to feel guilty. We talked. At first, it was easy, jokes, stories, meaningless things. But as the night wore on, the conversation turned deeper. The air between us grew heavier, charged with something neither of us dared name. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked suddenly, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. I hesitated. "Regret what?" He exhaled slowly, as if choosing his words carefully. "Not chasing the things that set your soul on fire." Something in my chest tightened. I could lie. I could tell him I was happy, that I had everything I wanted. But in that moment, with the weight of his gaze on me, the words wouldn't come. Instead, I whispered, "I don't know anymore." Daniel reached across the table, his fingers grazing mine. It was such a small touch, barely anything at all, yet it sent a shiver through me. I should have pulled away. I didn't. "I can't pretend anymore, Emily," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "I love you." The words hung in the air between us, irreversible. My breath caught, my heart hammering against my ribs. "Daniel," I started, but I didn't know what to say. "I know," he murmured. "I know it's complicated. But I also know you feel this too." Denial rose to my lips, but it was weak, and we both knew it. Because he was right. I had felt it for weeks, maybe even longer. The slow unraveling of something I had once believed unshakable. The terrifying, exhilarating possibility of something more. A part of me wanted to close the distance between us, to drown in the warmth of his touch. But then my phone buzzed on the table. Mark's name flashed on the screen, pulling me back to reality like a cold slap. I swallowed hard, my pulse pounding. I should go. Daniel's eyes darkened with something unreadable. He nodded, but he didn't look away. As I stood and walked out of the bar, my hands trembled. I had made my choice. But why did it feel like I was running from the only thing that had made me feel alive in years? I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard Daniel's voice, saw the way he looked at me, as if I were something precious, something worth waiting for. But then I would remember Mark, his steady presence, the years we had built together, the vows we had exchanged. The weight of it pressed down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. The next morning, I went through the motions. Made coffee. Answered emails. Pretended nothing had changed. But everything had. When Mark came home that evening, I watched him, really watched him, in a way I hadn't in a long time. He looked tired, distracted, barely glancing up from his phone as he muttered something about his trip. The silence stretched between us, familiar yet suffocating. I wanted to tell him. Not about Daniel, but about me. About how I felt like a shadow of the person I used to be. About the loneliness I had ignored for too long. But the words never came. Instead, I asked, "Mark, are you happy?" He frowned, finally looking at me. "What kind of question is that?" I hesitated, my throat tight. "I feel like we've been living on autopilot." Like we're just existing. He sighed, rubbing his temples. Emily, it's normal. Marriage isn't always exciting. You can't expect it to feel like it did in the beginning. I nodded, even though that wasn't what I had meant. Even though I wasn't sure I believed him. Days passed, and I avoided Daniel. I didn't answer his texts. I couldn't. Because I knew if I saw him, I might not have the strength to walk away again. Then, one evening, his name appeared on my phone. A simple message. ***, I'll always be here if you need me. ***. I stared at it for a long time, my heart aching. I wanted to respond, to say something, anything. But I knew that if I did, I would be stepping onto a path I couldn't turn back from. So I deleted the message. That night, as I lay beside Mark, staring at the ceiling, I realized something. This wasn't just about Daniel. It was about me. About the pieces of myself I had let slip away, the quiet resignation I had mistaken for stability. I didn't know what the future held. Whether I would stay, whether I would leave, whether love could be rekindled or if it was already too late. But for the first time in years, I wasn't willing to ignore my unhappiness. For the first time, I was ready to search for something more. Even if I had to find it alone.